George Orwell described doublethink as the power to hold two contradictory beliefs in one's mind simultaneously and accept both of them. Our leaders call it diplomacy.
人权保障啊，就全世界来讲，没有最好，只有更好。
Taiwan's existence is an embodiment of the profoundly irreconcilable difference between the free world and China, a difference that China are willing to settle by force.
我们不承诺放弃使用武力，保留采取一切必要措施的选项，针对的是外部势力干涉和极少数台独分裂分子。
This is a Chinese J-11 fighter jet. Two of them crossed the median line of the Taiwan Strait between Taiwan and China on Sunday morning. The two planes took off from Fuzhou, China at 11 a.m. and changed course near Taiwan's Penghu Islands. They were only 100 nautical miles from Taiwan. Taiwan jet fighters scrambled in response. Defense spokesman Chen Zongji said Taiwan's jet fighters are trained for this.
Taiwan is, for all intensive purposes, a country. But it's a country that everyone pretends is not a country. Our prime ministers, presidents, the UN, even the World Health Organization insists on pretending Taiwan isn't a country, even in the midst of a pandemic. Where I come from, England, Taiwan exists far enough away from most people's minds that it is quite possible to make it through your entire life without knowing a single thing about Taiwan or even being able to place it on a map. Once you do find out something about Taiwan, it becomes a fascinating place.
Why is it the best place in the world?
Don't put me on the spot.
It's impossible to really decide how you feel about Taiwan without also forming a strong opinion about China. Taiwan exists forever in the shadow of China. Just 130 kilometers off the coast, Taiwan lives with the constant threat of invasion. Taiwan is the largest and most populous disputed territory in the world. It also has earthquakes and typhoons, and to a young, fresh-faced man straight out of university, Taiwan seems like a very exciting adventure, and the furthest extreme from cloudy, drab London. On my way to Taiwan, I first went to China, where I stayed with a friend who was already living in Guangzhou. I found China fascinating. Everything was exciting. I even thought about living there instead of Taiwan. It was so obvious China was booming, and everybody seemed certain that China would be the next great superpower. I visited the trade markets and saw people who had dragged boxes of socks and t-shirts from an uncle's factory and made deals with Western businessmen that later made them richer than their wildest dreams. China was a superpower on the rise. But then tragedy struck and I had appendicitis. I was operated on in China back in 2004. I will never forget that hospital. In those days, Hu Jintao was the chairman of China. Due to my Chinese still being pretty weak, I wasn't able to talk to anyone about anything regarding politics or economics. I was not able to understand any of the propaganda, and so I didn't really understand what was going on in the political landscape. I do, however, remember the TV blacking out during a BBC report about something in China. The Chinese explained to me the signal was bad. I then hurried to Taiwan and left China behind. In many ways, Taiwan was the opposite of London. London was multicultural and global. Taiwan's way of life had not been sacrificed on the altar of diversity and globalism, as London's had. People in Taiwan appreciated their culture and wanted to keep it. Taiwan had very little crime. London had a lot. When Taiwan rained, it typhooned. When London rained, it pissed down for most of the day. Taiwan was scorching hot. London was freezing. I really enjoyed my early days in Taiwan. I got a job teaching kids in a school, and I watched many of my students grow up. I taught many of my students for over 10 years. Watching those children become adults has been one of the most unforgettable experiences of my life. I lived on a mountain and adopted 2 dogs. I would walk the dogs in the mountain in the evening and ride my motorbike around to teach my students during the day. Over the years, the tension between China and Taiwan grew. Wages stagnated and house prices boomed. Interest rates went down to the floor, and Taiwanese people struggled to buy a house and have children. Taiwan still has one of the lowest birth rates in the world. Today the birth rate is at 1.2 children per couple. I knew lots of wealthy people in Taiwan. Almost all fell into one of 3 categories: doctors, landowners, or people working in mainland China bringing money back to Taiwan, or with substantial investments in China that brought money back to Taiwan. Only these people seemed able to buy a house. As time went by, the spirit of Taiwanese nationalism rose month on month. Taiwanese flags were on everything. Video games, soft drinks, restaurants, they were hanging all over the place. I even saw a bag of carrots with the Taiwanese flag on it. It reminded me of the patriotism I saw while living in America, shortly after the Twin Towers came down. Back then, the flags were everywhere. The anti-Chinese rhetoric was also on the rise. I had had a lot of Chinese classmates while studying at uni in London. I found them to be nice people. I couldn't really say anything bad about them. As time went by, I felt more and more detached from Taiwan. I couldn't imagine I would ever be able to buy a house in Taipei. I couldn't see any other way to make more money, and nor could any of the Taiwanese people around me. Taiwan was all about being Taiwanese, and I wasn't Taiwanese. So I decided it was time to leave. Meanwhile, all this talk of China, and the fact that everyone around me who had any money had got it from China, had made me curious, and I knew I would make a lot more money in China. I also had a good friend there, so I went to live in China. I found the money was much easier to come by. This time was not like my first time in China. China had become much richer. 15 years had passed, skyscrapers were everywhere. People my age who had been selling socks to Westerners were now multi-millionaires, driving Benzes and BMWs. China was now making drones, phones and computers. The days of cheap socks were long gone. This time my Chinese was good enough that I could read the propaganda and watch the news. I talked to lots of people about politics and learnt to my horror that the fear the Taiwanese have about an invasion was justified. China had become a lot more authoritarian and tyrannical under Xi. This was not Hu Jintao's China, this was Xi Jinping's China. The improvements in technology meant that every taxi was fitted with voice and video recording, and all social media was bugged. Signs were everywhere, advertising money if one told the government a secret. The reward? The equivalent of £30,000. One of my favourite things to do whenever I go anywhere is to talk to taxi drivers. I believe a chat with a few taxi drivers can tell you so much about a country. In China, this was dicey business. Everything was being recorded.
但是我们千万不要以偏概全，一叶障目。我们不能因为一个村长的腐败就认为全国的村长都腐败，不能因为一个单位领导的无能就认为全国企业领导都无能，不能因为不幸发生在你自己身上或者发生在你身边就认为相同的不幸在全国上演。
While I met lots of lovely people in China, I couldn't help but recall all the things I had heard the Taiwanese tell me about the CCP. These voices in my head were impossible to ignore. And then the Hong Kong protests started. Shenzhen, the city I lived in, was only a metro ride away from Hong Kong. I had grown fond of Hong Kong. People were polite and friendly, no one pushed in front of you in the queue or defecated on the streets. Choosing a place to eat in Shenzhen was a bit like playing Russian roulette with your stomach. In Hong Kong, the food was delicious and came without a stomachache. The news of missing Hong Kong booksellers that had been kidnapped by the CCP seemed a long way away. But with this new extradition law, this would become the new standard for Hong Kong. Seeing 2 million people coming out to protest for their freedoms gave me goosebumps every time. The whole time I kept thinking, what does this mean for Taiwan? Taiwan has an army. Taiwanese people have become fiercely defensive of their country. The one country, two systems proposal for a peaceful digestion of the Taiwanese people into the mainland was dead in the water. Nobody wanted it. The only way I could see the Chinese taking Taiwan would be a hard invasion. What would that mean for all my Taiwanese students I had watched growing up? I realised that borders are there to keep the peace. Borders are what stop a bloodbath. Borders represent principles. People with vastly different values should be separated for the sake of peace. The CCP's attempt to erase its border with Hong Kong was unleashing a whirlwind of chaos. One of my Israeli friends living in Shenzhen said something to me that I will never forget. He was talking about the mass immigration of mainland Chinese people into Hong Kong when he said, if you replace the population of Hong Kong with mainlanders, is it still Hong Kong? Is Hong Kong just a location, or is it something more? If you replace the blade of a knife and then the handle, is it still the same knife? This was completely against the notions of globalism and diversity that I had been taught at school growing up in multicultural London. That some things are binary. They are either or. My globalist indoctrination had been shattered. I realised that the Taiwanese were right in insisting on the nation state and protecting themselves against outside influence. The overzealous Taiwanese nationalism was natural and necessary in the face of threats from China. Globalization had seen the interconnectivity of people and products and ideas and cultures from all around the world. In the West, we had had an unprecedented length of time without the threat of invasion from a hostile force, or the influence of a different kind of idea towards human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to openly criticize our government. Most of the world doesn't work like that, and probably never will. Not only that, the people of these countries didn't even want these freedoms.
我是中国人，我爸也是中国人。你为什么喜欢你的祖国？
I tried to talk to my Chinese friends about Hong Kong, but it was useless. In knocking down all other independent news reports, the CCP had created a collective conscience that could be spoon-fed any narrative it chose. I read my students' textbooks in China and watched them perform to me their Communist Party speeches. It became so obvious to me that the Chinese could be turned against Hong Kong with very little difficulty, and that exactly the same would happen with Taiwan. I'll finish this with a quote from Orwell that fits mainland China perfectly. He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past. I'd like to say a really big thank you to those people who've supported me on Patreon, PayPal, and those people who bought my stickers. It's been a massive help for me. These videos take a really long time to make. Thank you so much for your support. See you next time, guys. Peace.